perpetrating such offenses, the only perfect currency in circulation shall all at once represent the natural diminishment in remaining value of all wealth, while at all times remaining fully disposable to this very purpose. Only a currency in circulation meeting these requisites without exception, not only overall, but in the consideration of every involved individual, therefore, can at all times sustain a commerce comprised strictly of free, just trade of all wealth, and of just reward for production of all wealth. 2. As the general form of the present currency, and of any reasonable currency which can rightly represent an obligation to pay over the life cycle of represented property, is the promissory note, which inherently therefore represents a debtor's obligation to a real creditor who gives up property in exchange for evidence of the promissory obligation, and as the fulfillment of which obligation thus depends entirely on perpetually maintaining the integrity of the resultant currency. Nothing, therefore, can comprise actual monetary solution but a system of regulation which meets these requisites by complete eradication of manipulation, adulteration, or exploitation of the resultant promissory obligations, or the natural opportunity to make good on them. 3. As this implicit obligation to borrow at interest cannot be justified by purported risk, because all that is risked is the mere costs of publication, and as this implicit obligation to maintain a vital circulation inherently, irreversibly, and unavoidably engenders a maldisposition of the circulation, which across its breadth dedicates evermore of every unit of the circulation to servicing artificial indebtedness versus sustaining the industry which is obligated to do so. And therefore is inflation, deflation, maldisposition, systemic manipulation of the cost or value of money or property, an inherent, irreversible, and therefore terminal multiplication of artificial indebtedness not only engender terminal failure, but multiply the adverse injustices of the imposed systems of dispossession all along the way to terminal failure. Thus a vast array of injustices ensue, compelling us not only to arrest, but to every practical extent to repair the consequences of the present criminal obfuscation of currency. A. By immediately establishing a mathematically perfected economy in which 1. Which restores the right of every person, however individually or collectively, to issue legitimate promissory notes, to pay off the resultant obligation at no less than the rate of consumption or depreciation of the related property, all of which are certified and accounted for by a common monetary foundry, adhering to these principles in strictures and limitations prescribed by the people. In which 2. Thus the categoric faults of the present obfuscation of the promissory obligation are solved singularly, and I mean to stress that, singularly, by one and one only solution, are solved singularly by a fact of mathematically perfected economy, comprised of no more than an eradication of interest and an obligatory schedule of payment and retirement of principal, which maintains a perpetual 1-to-1-to-1 relationship between remaining value of represented property, representative circulation, and remaining obligation to fulfill every original commitment. Section 1.4, Vital Extension of Means to Absolute Consensual Representation. As the present crimes against us were imposed and likewise can only persist by breach of promise, deception, and thus wholly by breach of authorizable power. Thus, in order to preserve every intent of just rule by consent of the governed, no prospectively conducive means or juncture for affirmation, rejection, or refinement of rule or its consequences can be denied. Thus, every means of rendering absolute consensual representation prescribed herein shall be exercised not only in all matters henceforth, but in review of the entire body of prior law, with the natural purpose and consequence of this review understood explicitly to be eradication of a vast body of unjust law, regulation, and government, with a minimal body of remaining law to be consolidated purposely into the least, most just, most economic, and most efficient design, with the fullest accountability and severest penalty for every violation. That completes Section 1 of 10. Section 2. Necessary terms, scope, and verification of lawful authority. No authority over the people shall exist but to preserve every beneficial right to the explicit limits of infringement upon the equal rights of others. And to do so, every conceivable law or regulation shall stand only so long as without exception it is found to meet every demonstrably useful or necessary standard of common representation, including each of the following enumerated items. 1. In both its entire body and distinct expressions, all law must be distilled to the fewest necessary principles, and no body or case of law shall persist but as most simply and unambiguously represents and realizes those principles. 2. All law and ambitions to establish law shall so well set forth their purposes that no class of consequence shall be undeclared, concealed, or inadvertent. No law shall be of any force or legitimacy whatever otherwise, nor shall it stand or be exercised from the moment it is demonstrated not to serve its declared purposes, or that its purposes do not serve, without exception or recognizable possibility of betterment, the common and equal rights of all citizens. 3. All law shall set forth the most effective and just means of achieving its purposes. And that means shall neither stand nor be exercised from the moment it is demonstrated not to most effectively and justly achieve those purposes. 4. No law, bill, or act shall combine unrelated purposes, and neither proposal, passage, or enforceability shall be decided but by exceeding merits of its means to common supreme purposes. 4a. It shall be the recognized lawful obligation of all citizens of a republic, therefore, in all cases, to vote not for personal or divisive interests, but only for a fact of compliant, undefective, common representation, and to strictly oppose anything and everything less. 4b. Citizens, purported authorities, and officers of government negligently deviating from this obligation shall be accountable for damages inflicted, including costs of claiming damage. This is to apply throughout the land as the supreme law of the land, eliminating all breach of power in all government at all levels. 5. No reduced quorum, regardless of ostensible authority, shall be deemed to have passed any government act. In other words, the Federal Reserve Act would never have been passed. And no legislative passage shall exist without a lawful majority of no less than half of the total possible legislative vote, with unexercised votes counting always against election or passage. 6. No law or resultant process or power shall be exercised without final public affirmation by a lawful majority of the people, and no law or resultant process or power shall remain in force without periodic public reaffirmation by no less than a lawful majority, which in no case shall be less than half of the affected or lawfully deciding public, whichever is greater, and which reaffirmation shall transpire both regularly and upon incident, as will suffice to eradicate injustice and transgression. 7. No power to pardon abuse of power or breach of legal authority shall exist. Any agent of abuse of power or breach of authority shall be liable for all damages inflicted, however indirect or remote, and the supporters of any cause or obstruction of necessary cause shall be held responsible and liable for their influence in resultant incongruities, damages, and defects, as documented by obligatory public voting records. 7a. Voting shall effectively be an obligation of representative government by consent of the governed, with a right to implicitly vote against all subject issues honored in the case of intentional absence, and not absolving the voter from accountability except by inadvertent absence. 7b. No right to vote carelessly or to evade responsibility for voting carelessly shall exist. These reasons, of course, are why we have lost